This is a quick tutorial on how to use the tables in the Agronomy Guide, publication 811 from the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs to determine the different rates of nutrients for your crops. I'm going to use cereals as an example because cereals is quite a common crop and it covers off most of the steps that you must take. The only difference with crops is with corn and nitrogen. There's a corn nitrogen calculator, and I have prepared a separate tutorial on how to use the corn nitrogen calculator. Okay, so for nitrogen requirements, in this case for cereal crops, this is on page 127 of publication 811, the Agronomy Guide, and it is table 4-13, entitled Nitrogen Requirements for Cereal Crops. And so you can see that in this table, we have the various cereal crops listed down the left-hand side, and we have the nitrogen required down the right-hand side. All you have to do is go down and select the crop that you're growing. For example, for barley, there's two options for barley, one for areas receiving 2800 heat units or less, and one for 2800 heat units or more. And you read off the nitrogen required directly from the table. So for areas receiving 2800 crop heat units or less, you would choose 70 to 90 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. That translates to 63 to 81 pounds per acre of nitrogen, and you would select based on past history for the field. The various other crops are also split into southern and northern Ontario, or areas receiving more or less than a certain number of heat units, and that's because typically with spring grains, Southern Ontario yields are quite a bit less, so we usually have less nitrogen requirement for those cereals in those situations. The exception with cereals is with pastry wheat, or soft white winter wheat, or soft red winter wheat, and so that is on a separate table, and we'll go through that separate table now. Unlike most of the cereal crops, pastry wheat or winter wheat requires different rates of nutrients, of nitrogen, depending on a couple of factors. It depends on two things. It depends on the expected yield, and you'll notice going across the top we have various expected yields for winter wheat, and the nitrogen rate also depends on the nitrogen to wheat price ratio. Okay, so the more valuable wheat is and the cheaper nitrogen is, the more we can afford to apply. So we get a different ratio, and so we have different rates of nitrogen. Now, the way you calculate the price ratio is to take the price of nitrogen, the price of the nitrogen source you're going to use in dollars per ton, divide by the number of kilograms of nutrient in the ton to get a value for each kilogram of nitrogen. Then you take the value of the wheat, or so what the price of wheat is. In this case, $250 per ton is 25 cents a kilogram. So the price ratio, you take the value of a kilogram of nitrogen, divide it by the value of a kilogram of wheat to get a value. Okay, so in this case, it's $1.25 divided by 25 cents, which is 5. So the price ratio in this example is 5, and so we would use the nitrogen to wheat price ratio of 5 in the table, in table 4-14, which, by the way, is on page 128. And so in this example, let's say we had a price ratio of 5, and let's say our crop insurance yield of winter wheat was 7 tons per hectare. So we would choose our price ratio of 5. We would go straight across to the column with our expected yield. And by the way, your expected yield is what you get, not what you want. And so so the crop insurance value is a good number to use for the expected yield. So price ratio of 5, expected yield of 7 tons per hectare. We would require 125 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. So we're just reading a number off a table. So in this case, we need 125 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare to supply the nitrogen to our wheat crop. Now there is another table, table 4-15, for managing for increased protein. And so you could use that if you need more, more protein, if you have a protein premium coming to you, but we won't worry about that right now. If you do need more protein, contact your fertilizer professional and they'll help you out. And the next thing we'll do is we'll look at making phosphorus and potassium recommendations for cereals. The tables for phosphorus and potash for all crops are essentially the same. The only thing really different is the actual recommendations and the crops that are listed on the table. So the table we're going to look at is table 4-20, 4-20 on page 131 of the Agronomy Guide. And this is the phosphate guidelines for cereals. And so all these tables are set up the same way, where on the left-hand column there is a soil test value, and across the top there are different crops listed. So in this case, let's say we have winter wheat, and let's say we have a sodium bicarbonate phosphorus soil test of 9 parts per million. So that number comes off your soil test report you get back from sending a soil sample in. And so we go down the sodium bicarbonate phosphorus soil test column until we get to the soil test value, which in this case is 9. And then we would go straight across to the column with the crop that we are growing listed or labeled. So in this case, we're growing winter wheat. And so we go down the winter wheat column and across the 9 parts per million column until they intersect, and we find that we need approximately 30 kilograms per hectare of phosphorus on our winter wheat crop. Now it doesn't matter what the crop is, the tables are all the same, and each crop will have its own, or each grouping of crops will have its own table in the Agronomy Guide. For example, corn has its own table, soybeans have their own table, forages have their own table, canola has its own table. So depending on the crop you're growing, you will go to the appropriate section in the Agronomy Guide to find the appropriate table in the book. So the last nutrient we'll look at is potassium, and you'll see some similarities between potassium and phosphorus, or you should anyway. This is the potash table for cereals. It is table 4-21, and it is on page 132 in the Agronomy Guide. And you can see it looks very similar to the phosphorus table we just looked at. The only difference really is, well, the numbers are different, but it's the ammonium acetate potassium soil test values on the left-hand side. And you'll see the listing of crops as you go across the top. So in this case, let's say we had a soil test value of 80 parts per million. So we go down the ammonium acetate potassium soil test till we get to 80 parts per million. Remember that 80 parts per million would come from your soil test report that you get back from the lab. And we go straight across to the winter wheat column, since we're growing winter wheat, and we would find, in this case, that we would need 20 kilograms per hectare of potash, or K2O, to grow this crop of winter wheat with a soil test value of 80 parts per million. Now remember that the K2O value is nutrient, and you still have to convert that nutrient to the actual amount of phosphorus, but that is something we'll leave for a different assignment, a different video. Okay, so that's how you would do find the amount of nutrient you need for, in this case, cereals. And all crops are similar to cereals, except they use different tables and different numbers. And so getting your nutrient requirements is a matter of looking them up in the appropriate table in the Agronomy Guide published by OMAFRA.